What compels you to be in town right now, and should all members of the House be here?
Yeah, well, let me just point out that it's not just that the House is not in session. The Speaker of the House has shut down the House and is refusing to call his own members back to Washington, D.C. And in fact, Democrats have shown up now. Week 2, we are here. We are fighting to get a bipartisan deal to reopen the government, to address American health care costs, and to make sure that our democracy works for all Americans. And if Mike Johnson is not going to call us back, we are still going to continue to show up for the American people, because that is what we do. Now, I do take a little bit of difference with what I just heard from my colleague across the aisle here in the Senate. We are fighting to make sure that Americans' health care doesn't get jacked up in the coming weeks. We're talking about your health care premiums going from, let's say, $300, $400 a month up to $800, $1,000 a month. This is not just some hypothetical about health care policy. This is about real costs that real Americans are going to feel in the next few weeks if we don't act now.
Well, you know what Republicans say about this, and we just heard from Jason Smith before you joined us, that this is unrelated to the funding issue, that Democrats don't object to anything in the bill, so you should pass it and get the Congress reopened to actually have a negotiation over Obamacare subsidies. How would you respond to him?
Well, that's absolutely ridiculous, because Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House, and they spent the first 9 months of this year working on a domestic policy package that cut health care, that cut food assistance, that cut educational assistance, and that gave billionaires multi-billion-dollar tax breaks permanently and slashed benefits for millions of Americans. And so for them to claim that you shouldn't use a budgetary process to enact policy is the most ludicrous thing I have ever heard in my life, because they just spent 9 months doing that and taking American health care away, and now they're refusing to fix what they broke. So their arguments hold no water, and the fact that the House is closed and the Speaker is refusing to bring people back to even negotiate, even if they did want to cut a deal, they couldn't, because the House isn't even here.
Part of the reason why I wanted to talk with you, Congresswoman, is that you're a former OMB staffer, and the Office of Management and Budget has the keys to the castle, the keys, I should say, to the castle right now. President Trump is talking about potentially laying off mass numbers of furloughed workers. He's also suggesting that some of the furloughed workers now who are not receiving paychecks not be made whole when they come back to work. I realize the Speaker takes issue with that. He believes that federal workers should be paid and receive back pay when they come back. But as somebody who's been inside the agency at OMB, talk to us about the decisions that are being made right now and how much leeway Russ Vought has over federal spending.
Well, I think we've seen time and time again, this administration seems to have very little regard for the law, but the law is very clear here. You cannot fire federal workers during a shutdown, and we passed legislation in 2019 to guarantee back pay for federal workers. So whatever the president says, he cannot just make stuff up. The law applies, and they cannot withhold pay from federal workers. So if you are a federal worker out there listening to this, if you receive a RIF notice, if you receive notice that you're not going to receive back pay, that is just untrue. You have rights, and the law is on your side.
Congresswoman Stansbury, I want to ask you about a separate matter as National Guard troops mobilize outside of Chicago. It appears that we have a third city now where National Guard troops are being deployed by the president. But there's something interesting that's been going on in your state. The Washington Post reported on this a couple of weeks ago, because there are, in fact, National Guard members who have been in the city of Albuquerque now for more than 100 days. The headline on the story: this blue state governor sent the National Guard to her biggest city. No guns, no Humvees, no arrests. This deployment looks very different from the way President Trump has used soldiers in places like D.C. and Chicago. In fact, you've got guys and gals walking around in black polo shirts and khakis, not carrying firearms, and have actually come to know some people in the community. Some folks have come to rely on them. What is your governor, Lujan Grisham, doing differently than the president in making this work?
Well, there's a fundamental difference between a governor coordinating with local officials and local law enforcement to provide additional support and backup where it is wanted and discussed and deployed in a safe manner in a community versus the president illegally deploying National Guard to states and cities where it is unwanted, where the governors and mayors have said, no, do not send them, and is trying to use legal authorities that frankly don't exist. It's also very clear that the president is doing this as a show of force. He is trying to scare the American people. He is trying to show that he has power, and he's going to send individuals in with guns to scare the American people to back up his policies. But that is not the same as a coordinated legal authority under which a governor and local authorities use the deployment as a way to support local law enforcement.
Well, I think it's a fascinating story because this is, of course, an extremely controversial issue when you factor in the matter of posse comitatus. And to see this happening in your city with crime in Albuquerque now falling across most all categories, this idea in this year, I guess it runs against the grain of those criticizing the idea of using National Guard troops and speaks to the nuances of how we can use them. Do you agree?
No, because actually the reason why crime is falling in Albuquerque is because we have had a sustained investment over the last 7 years in behavioral health programs and getting fentanyl off the street and in community policing. And so the ad over the last, several weeks of additional support for law enforcement helps to relieve pressure on existing law enforcement, but it is not what actually drove crime rates down in Albuquerque. What drove crime rates down was actually investing in our community and behavioral health.
Would you like to see these 100 or so troops continue their jobs in Albuquerque?
What I would like to see is continued investment in behavioral health and getting fentanyl off the street, because that is the #1 thing driving crime in most major cities in America right now. And we have an addiction crisis, and we need to be investing in our communities.
Now we're talking about National Guard troops, and there's a question about active duty military troops going without pay starting on the 15th, Congresswoman. Some folks are pushing for a standalone piece of legislation to pay them out of money from the president's big, beautiful bill. We've only got about a minute left. Speaker Johnson says no, we already passed a bill to pay the troops. How about you?
I personally think we need to pay our troops. We're here in the Capitol. Our Capitol Police are not getting paid. We need to pay our troops, pay our federal employees, and get the government reopened, and that requires Mike Johnson reopening the House.